The wind on the high plains had teeth, and it bit without mercy. It tore at the thin shawl draped over Alara's shoulders, a futile defense against a landscape that was all sharp edges and vast, unforgiving sky. Dust, the color of rust and regret, swirled in the single street of Providence, clinging to her worn skirts and coating her tongue. Each grain felt like a judgment. Before her, the door to Mr. Abernathy's mercantile was a solid, unmoving slab of wood, as closed and final as his face had been moments before. His words, though spoken in a low, furious whisper so as not to cause a scene, echoed louder in her mind than a gunshot. "A child? You bring another man's shame to my door." His gaze had not been on her, not on the woman who had traveled 1,000 miles on the promise of his letters, but on the small, sleeping bundle cradled in her arms. The baby, her Rose, was the sum of a love and a loss so profound it had hollowed Alara out, and now, that sacred emptiness was being called shame. He had rejected the child, and in doing so had rejected the very soul of the woman he had pledged to marry. The stares of the few townspeople who had witnessed the exchange were like stones. They saw a fallen woman, a burden, an inconvenience brought by the afternoon stagecoach. They did not see a mother whose world had been reduced to the fragile life she held, the soft, rhythmic puff of breath against her collarbone the only proof that anything good remained. Despair was a cold, heavy thing settling in her gut. The last of her money had been spent on the journey, a foolish investment in a future that had just evaporated into the gritty air. She was a ghost in a strange land, with no shelter but the shadow of the gallows a few hundred yards away, a stark reminder of the swift and brutal justice of this new territory. She could feel the cold seeping into Rose's blankets and pulled the baby tighter, a primal, desperate gesture. Her own fear was a luxury. The child's survival was the only currency that mattered. From across the street, leaning against the raw timber of the smithy, a man watched. She had not noticed him, her world having shrunk to the size of her own failure. He was tall and broad, dressed in buckskin and dust, his features obscured by the shadow of his hat brim. He made no move, offered no word. He was simply a part of the harsh scenery, as immovable as the distant, tooth-like mountains. Alara turned away from the accusing silence of the town and walked, her steps unsteady, toward the livery stable at the edge of the settlement. It smelled of hay and manure and honest labor, a scent less offensive than the cloying perfume of hypocrisy she just fled. The stable master, a man with kind but weary eyes, took her last few coins for a corner in the loft, a space away from the horses and the drafts. It was not a home. It was a hole to crawl into, a place to hide from the wind and the world's sharpened eyes. As she climbed the rickety ladder, the baby stirring with a soft cry, she felt the weight of that silent watcher's gaze on her back. A pressure she could not name, an observation without pity or condemnation. It was just there, up in the loft, with straw for a mattress and a horse blanket for a door. Alara curled herself around Rose, her own body a shield. The sun bled out of the sky, leaving behind a bruised, purple twilight, and the wind howled its lonely, endless song. The days that followed bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of fear and endurance. Alara's world was the hayloft, its dusty shafts of light marking the slow passage of time. Her small store of dried biscuits dwindled, and the milk she bought with the pittance she earned mending torn grain sacks for the stable master was never quite enough. Each night, she listened to the sounds of the town, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the boisterous shouts from the saloon, the creak of wagon wheels, and felt an isolation so complete it was a physical ache. She was an island, and the tide of her resources was going out. The town's women looked through her, their gazes sliding past as if she were made of glass. The men looked at her with a different kind of appraisal, a speculative gleam that made her skin crawl and hold Rose tighter. She was prey here, and she knew it. Then the offerings began. The first was a small stack of firewood, neatly cut and stacked just outside the livery's side entrance, far from the main traffic. She saw it at dawn and assumed it was for the stable master, but he shook his head, his gaze curious. Hesitantly, she took it. The dry would a promise of warmth against the biting chill of the nights. The next morning, a pail of milk sat in the same spot, still warm, a thin layer of cream collecting at its surface. This was no accident. Her heart hammered with a mixture of suspicion and a desperate, rising hope. She looked around, scanning the quiet street, but saw no one. It was the man from the smithy. She knew it instinctively. Silas, the stable master, had called him. He lived alone on a small homestead a few miles out, a man of few words and fewer friends. A man who kept to himself. Why would he help her? Pity, perhaps. But his gaze that first day had held no pity. It was something quieter, more assessing. A few days later, a skinned rabbit appeared, wrapped in clean cloth. The offering was a lifeline. She cooked it over her small, carefully tended fire, the smell of roasting meat a forgotten luxury. As she ate, she portioned a tiny, tender piece for Rose, who was now old enough for tastes of solid food. She began to watch for him. She would see him in town, trading furs or buying supplies, his movements economical and deliberate. He never looked toward the livery, never acknowledged her existence. Yet the gifts continued. A sack of potatoes, a jar of preserved peaches, its sweetness an impossible treasure. A thick wool blanket, worn but clean. He was provisioning her, sustaining her, with a silence that was more profound than any declaration. She saw him one afternoon, sitting on a bench outside the smithy, a block of pale wood in his hands. He held a knife with practiced ease, long, careful strokes shaving away curls of wood that fell like soft petals to the dust. He was not whittling a toy or an idle trinket. His focus was too intense, the lines he carved too precise. He was making something important. The slow, rhythmic scrape of his knife became a sound of quiet creation in a world that had only sought to tear her down. A fragile trust began to sprout in the barren soil of her heart. He was not offering charity. He was offering a chance, a breath, and for now that was more than enough. The sky had been a deceptive, brilliant blue all day, a liar's sky. By late afternoon, it had turned the color of a bruise, a dark, malevolent gray that swallowed the mountains whole. The wind, always a persistent bully on the plains, changed its tune. It rose from a moan to a shriek, carrying the first stinging pellets of ice. A blizzard, not just a snowstorm, but one of the white monsters the old-timers spoke of with a grim reverence. The stable master rushed to secure the main doors, his face etched with worry. "This ain't a night to be out, miss," he'd said, his eyes flicking upward toward her loft. Or in a barn, but there was nowhere else to go. The livery, which had been her meager sanctuary, now felt like a trap. The wind found every crack in the old wood, knifing through with icy drafts that extinguished her small fire and stole the warmth from her body. Rose, sensing the terror in the air and the encroaching cold, began to wail, a thin, piercing sound that the wind seemed to mock and amplify. Alara wrapped the baby in every scrap of cloth she possessed. The wool blanket a godsend, but it wasn't enough. She could feel the chill seeping into the tiny body, a deadly cold that her own warmth could not fight. She held Rose against her skin beneath her dress, rocking and praying, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. The world outside had dissolved into a roaring, blinding whiteness. The stable became a tomb of groaning timbers and freezing air. This is how it ends, she thought, a wave of numb finality washing over her. Not with a bang, but with a whimper, frozen in a stranger's barn. Her resilience, worn thin by weeks of hardship, finally snapped. A dry, ragged sob escaped her lips. Just as she surrendered to the despair, a sound cut through the storm's fury, a heavy, scraping thud from below. The main door, footsteps, heavy and sure, crossed the stable floor. They stopped at the bottom of her ladder. Fear, sharp and electric, jolted her. Was it one of the saloon men, drunk and cruel? She clutched Rose so tightly the baby cried out again. The ladder creaked. A large silhouette blotted out the dim light from below, and then he was there, filling the small space of her loft. It was Silas. Snow clung to his shoulders and the brim of his hat. His face was stark in the gloom, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He did not speak. His eyes, dark and intense, took in the scene at a glance. Her huddled form, the crying baby, the pathetic, dead fire. He simply extended a hand, palm up. It was not a question. It was a command, gentle but absolute. For a heartbeat, she hesitated. The ingrained fear of a woman alone warring with the instinct that told her this was her only salvation. She looked from his steady hand to his unwavering gaze, and in that moment, she chose to trust. She bundled Rose back into the blankets and followed him down the ladder and into the raging heart of the blizzard. The wind tore the breath from her lungs, the snow a blinding, swirling vortex. He put his body between her and the worst of the gale, his large frame a shield, and led her through the white chaos toward a faint, beckoning light. It was his cabin, a small, sturdy structure that stood defiant against the storm. He pushed open the door, and a wave of glorious, impossible warmth washed over her. A fire roared in the stone hearth, casting a golden, dancing light over the single, clean room. He guided her inside and shut the door, silencing the howl of the storm to a muffled roar. He took the shivering bundle from her numb arms, his large, calloused hands impossibly gentle as he unwrapped the baby. Then he turned and gestured toward the hearth. There, sitting on the warm stone, was what he had been carving. A cradle, simple, solid, and smooth, fashioned from pale, sanded wood. It was built with a craftsman's care, the rockers perfectly curved, the sides high enough to keep out the drafts. He laid Rose inside, tucking the blankets securely around her. The baby, soothed by the radiant heat and the gentle rocking motion, let out a soft sigh and fell quiet, her breathing evening out into the peaceful rhythm of sleep. Alara stood, dripping and shivering, and stared at the fire, at the baby safe in her bed, at the man who had built a sanctuary for her child before she even knew how to ask for one. The storm raged for 2 days, imprisoning them in the small, warm cabin. Outside, the world was an apocalypse of wind and snow, a furious white chaos that scoured the land clean. Inside, there was a profound and enveloping silence. It was not the awkward silence of strangers, but a quiet that was full of unspoken things. Gratitude, relief, a shared understanding forged in the crucible of the blizzard. Alara watched Silas move about the small space. He was a man of immense physical presence, yet he moved with a quiet economy, never wasting a step or a gesture. He tended the fire, checked on the sleeping child, and prepared broth and bread, all without a word. The cradle he had made sat near the hearth, a solid, tangible symbol of an incredible kindness. She would run her hand over the smooth, planed wood, marveling at the care that had gone into its construction. He had seen her need before she could voice it, had answered a prayer she hadn't dared to utter. On the second night, as he sat cleaning a rifle by the firelight, the only sound the soft click of metal and the crackle of burning pine, he finally spoke. His voice was a low rumble, rough from disuse but steady. She needed a proper bed. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on his work, but the words were laid gently in the space between them. All the fear, the shame, and the desperate loneliness of the past weeks crested within Alara, and she could only nod, a knot of emotion too tight in her throat to allow for speech. It was an acknowledgement of Rose, not as a burden or a shame, but as a child who deserved comfort and safety. In that simple statement, he had given Alara back a piece of her own dignity. When the storm finally broke, revealing a world blanketed in pristine, dazzling white, she did not leave. He did not ask her to. An unspoken agreement had been settled. Her corner in the hayloft was a memory of a past life. She began to find her own rhythm within the cabin's walls, mending his clothes, cooking their shared meals, adding a touch of order to his solitary existence. She was not a guest, nor was she a servant. She was becoming a partner. He would go out to hunt or check his trap lines, and she would keep the home, the warmth, the life inside the sturdy walls. One evening, she watched him from the doorway as he sat on the porch, mending a broken harness. With the toe of his boot, He was gently, rhythmically rocking the cradle where Rose slept peacefully. The harsh landscape that had once terrified her now seemed different, seen from the shelter of this place. It was still a wild and demanding land, but it was no longer an enemy. It was simply home. A quiet strength had taken root in her, erasing the ghost of the woman who had arrived in Providence full of false hope and fear. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a woman who had found a foothold, a quiet harbor built not on a promise spoken in a letter, but on an act of profound and silent grace.